Hey guys, Brock showed here. Back with you with the next video in our series, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Without further ado, returning to Great Expectations. Good, said Mr. Pumblechook conceitedly. This is the way to have him. We're beginning to hold our own, I think, Mum. I am sure, returned Mrs. Joe. I wish you had him always. You know so well how to deal with him. Now, boy, what was she a doing of when you went in today? Asked Mr. Pumblechook. She was sitting, I answered, in a black velvet coach. Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another as they well might, and both repeated, In a black velvet coach? Yes, said I, and Miss Estella, that's her niece, I think, handed her in cake and wine at the coach window on a gold plate. And we all had cake and wine on gold plates. And I got up behind the coach to eat mine, because she told me to. Was anybody else there? Asked Mr. Pumblechook. 4 dogs, said I, large or small. Immense, said I, and they fought for veal cutlets out of a silver basket. Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another again in utter amazement. I was perfectly frantic, a reckless witness under the torture, and would have told them anything. Where was this coach, in the name of gracious? Asked my sister. In Miss Havisham's room. They started again. But there weren't any horses to it. I added this saving clause, in the moment of rejecting 4 richly caparisoned coursers, which I had had wild thoughts of harnessing. Can this be possible, uncle? Asked Mrs. Joe. What can the boy mean? I'll tell you, Mum, said Mr. Pumblechook. My opinion is, it's a sedan chair. She's flighty, you know. Very flighty. Quite flighty. Enough to pass her days in a sedan chair. Did you ever see her in it, uncle? Asked Mrs. Joe. How could I? He returned, forced to the admission, when I never see her in my life, never clapped eyes upon her. Goodness, uncle, and yet you have spoken to her. Why, don't you know? Said Mr. Pumblechook testily. That's when I have been there. I have been took up to the outside of the door, and the door has stood ajar, and she has spoke to me that way. Don't say you don't know that, Mum. Howsoever the boy went there to play. What did you play at, boy? We played with flags, I said. I beg to observe that I think of myself with amazement when I recall the lies I told on this occasion. Flags, echoed my sister. Yes, said I. Estella waved a blue flag, and I waved a red one. And Miss Havisham waved one sprinkled all over with little gold stars out a coach window, and then we all waved our swords and hurrahed. Swords, repeated my sister. Where did you get swords from? Out of a cupboard, said I, and I saw pistols in it, and jam and pills, and there was no daylight in the room, but it was all lighted up with candles. That's true, Mum, said Mr. Pumblechook with a grave nod. That's the state of the case, for that much I've seen myself. And then they both stared at me, and I, with an obtrusive show of artlessness on my countenance, stared at them, and plaited the right leg of my trousers with my right hand. If they had asked me any more questions, I should undoubtedly have betrayed myself, for I was even then on the point of mentioning that there was a balloon in the yard, and should have been hazarded the statement, but for my invention being divided between that phenomenon and a bear in the brewery. They were so much occupied, however, in discussing the marvels I had already presented for their consideration that I escaped. The subject still held them when Joe came in from his work to have a cup of tea, to whom my sister, more for the relief of her own mind than for the gratification of his, related my pretended experiences. Now, when I saw Joe open his blue eyes and roll them all round the kitchen in helpless amazement, I was overtaken by penitence, but only as regarded him, not in the least as regarded the other two. Towards Joe and Joe only, I considered myself a young monster, while they sat debating what results would come to me from Miss Havisham's acquaintance and favor. They had no doubt that Miss Havisham would do something for me. Their doubts related to the form that something would take. My sister stood out for property. Mr. Pumblechook was in favor of a handsome premium for binding me apprentice to some genteel trade, say, the corn and seed trade, for instance. Joe fell into the deepest disgrace with both for offering the bright suggestion that I might only be presented with one of the dogs who had fought for the veal cutlets. If a fool's head can't express better opinions than that, said my sister, and you have got any work to do, you had better go and do it. So he went. After Mr. Pumblechook had driven off, and when my sister was washing up, I stole into the forge to Joe, and remained by him until he had done for the night. Then I said, "Before the fire goes out, Joe, I should like to tell you something." "Should you, Pip?" said Joe, drawing his shoeing stool near the forge. "Then tell us, what is it, Pip?" "Joe," said I, taking up his rolled up shirt sleeve and twirling it between my finger and thumb. "You remember all that about Miss Havisham?" "Remember?" said Joe. "I believe you. Wonderful." "It's a terrible thing, Joe. It ain't true." "What are you telling of, Pip?" cried Joe, falling back in the greatest amazement. "You don't mean to say it's—" "Yes, I do. It's lies, Joe. But not all of it. Why, sure you don't mean to say, Pip, that there was no black velvet coach? For I stood shaking my head. But at least there were dogs, Pip. Come, Pip, said Joe persuasively. If there weren't no veal cutlets, at least there was dogs. No, Joe. A dog? Said Joe. A puppy? Come. No, Joe. There was nothing at all of the kind. As I fixed my eyes hopelessly on Joe, Joe contemplated me in dismay. Pip, old chap, this won't do, old fellow, I say. Where do you expect me to go? Where do you expect to go to? It's terrible, Joe, ain't it? Terrible, cried Joe. Awful. What possessed you? I don't know what possessed me, Joe, I replied, letting his shirt sleeve go, and sitting down in the ashes at his feet, hanging my head. But I wish you hadn't taught me to call knaves at cards, Jacks, and I wish my boots weren't so thick, nor my hands so coarse. And then I told Joe that I felt very miserable, and that I hadn't been able to explain myself to Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook, who were so rude to me, and that there had been a beautiful young lady at Miss Havisham's, who was dreadfully proud, and that she had said I was common, and that I knew I was common, and that I wished I was not common, and that the lies had come out of it somehow, though I didn't know how. This was a case of metaphysics, at least as difficult for Joe to deal with as for me. But Joe took the case altogether out of the region of the metaphysics, and by that means vanquished it. We'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.